The Apache tribe accused the rancher, until the chief's daughter spoke 4 revealing words. The morning sun rose slowly over the quiet valley, casting long golden rays across the rolling fields and the rancher's land. The rancher, Thomas, was already awake, moving among his cattle with practiced ease. He had lived in the valley for many years, tending his ranch with patience and care. His life was simple, and he enjoyed the peace the land offered. Birds chirped, the wind rustled through the tall grass, and for a moment the world seemed calm and safe. But calm rarely lasted long in a place where history carried its own weight. That morning, a strange tension hung in the air. Thomas noticed it first as he leaned against the fence, looking at the distant line of trees where the Apache land began. There were signs of commotion, small groups of people gathering, whispered voices, and a nervous energy he could feel but not yet understand. Something was wrong. The day before, a minor incident had occurred near the border between Thomas's ranch and the Apache lands. A horse had wandered off and caused some damage to the crops of the nearby community. It was a small matter, the kind that usually resolved itself with a simple apology, but rumors spread faster than truth ever could. By morning, the whispers had turned into loud accusations. Thomas had become the subject of suspicion. He didn't understand it at first. He had always been careful to respect the land and its people. He knew the rules: never cross the boundaries without permission, never harm the crops or the animals that belonged to the tribe, and always show respect to the elders. He had even shared his harvest with the community on occasion. Yet, despite all this, he could feel the weight of eyes watching him, judging him without listening. By mid-morning, a few young men from the tribe arrived at the edge of his property. They stood in a line, hesitant but firm, and one of them spoke first. "Thomas," the young man said, his voice steady but not cruel, "the elders want to speak with you. There has been an accusation." Thomas nodded slowly. He had expected some kind of misunderstanding, but he didn't know it would escalate so quickly. "I will come," he said calmly, though inside he felt a knot of worry tighten. He gathered his hat, wiped his hands on his coat, and walked toward the meeting place, his steps measured. The cattle watched him go, sensing the unease in the air. The gathering was already forming by the time he arrived. Elders from the Apache community were seated in a semicircle, their faces serious. A larger crowd had begun to form behind them, curious and anxious to witness what would happen. Thomas stood quietly, giving them respect, and waited for someone to speak. He could feel the tension in the air, a mixture of anger, fear, and expectation. The chief, a tall and dignified man with silver streaks in his hair, rose from his seat. His voice was calm but carried authority. "Thomas," he said, "we have heard troubling reports. Some crops were damaged and some animals were found where they should not be. Many believe it was your cattle that caused this. We must hear the truth." Thomas took a deep breath. He knew the truth and he hoped it would be enough. "Chief, I assure you I have been careful. I did not send my cattle onto your land intentionally. I respect the boundary between our properties. If any damage occurred, I am willing to make it right." But his words seemed to fall into the wind. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some people nodded, others shook their heads. Fear and suspicion had a way of spreading quickly, and it was hard to reverse once it took hold. The elders exchanged glances, silent conversations passing between them. Thomas could feel the judgment pressing down on him, heavy and uncomfortable. One of the elders, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that commanded attention, spoke next. "We have heard many things," she said. "The land has suffered and many believe the rancher is responsible. We must decide what to do." Thomas's heart sank. He had not expected hostility, only a chance to explain himself. He realized that proving the truth would be harder than he thought. The stories of the damage had grown in the telling, each one adding more blame. By now, he was not just accused of a mistake. He was being accused of carelessness, disrespect, and harm. He looked around at the crowd. Faces were tense, eyes suspicious. Even some of his neighbors, who had always known him as honest and fair, had begun to doubt. It was a strange, isolating feeling to be seen as guilty when he knew he was innocent. Yet he remained calm. He had learned long ago that anger and frustration rarely helped. Patience and honesty were the only tools he had in this moment. Hours passed as the elders discussed among themselves. Thomas stood quietly listening. He could hear snippets of conversation. Some spoke of fairness, some of tradition, and some of fear. The valley, which had seemed so peaceful that morning, now felt like a stage for judgment. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the lowing of cattle, the whisper of the wind, seemed amplified in the tension. Finally, the chief spoke again. "We must hear more. There is a meeting planned this afternoon with the full council and the community. We will decide then." "Thomas, you are asked to appear. This is not a punishment, but a chance for the truth to be told." Thomas nodded again, though inside he felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. He was relieved that he would have the opportunity to speak, but anxious about the scrutiny he would face. He returned to his ranch, where his faithful dog waited, sensing the unease in his master. He patted the dog's head and sighed. There would be a long day ahead, and the outcome was uncertain. That afternoon, as Thomas prepared to go to the meeting, neighbors and onlookers began to gather. Some were supportive, offering quiet words of encouragement. Others whispered doubts, unsure whether the rancher could be trusted. Thomas walked steadily, trying to keep his mind clear, focusing on what he knew to be true. He thought of the small details, how he had checked the fences, how he had guided the cattle away from the border, how he had always shown respect to the land and its people. As he approached the gathering place, he could see the Apache leaders waiting. The chief's daughter, a young woman known for her wisdom and fairness, stood nearby, observing the crowd. Her presence was calming, though Thomas did not know it yet. The people waited silently, anticipation heavy in the air. Every step Thomas took felt measured, as if the valley itself held its breath. The meeting began with formal greetings. Thomas explained everything he knew about the incident, speaking clearly and calmly. He detailed how the cattle had wandered, how he had tried to prevent any damage, and how he had always respected the boundaries. He spoke not only of the facts but of his intentions, hoping that honesty would be enough to persuade them. But the crowd was divided. Some believed him, seeing the care in his words and the sincerity in his eyes. Others were still suspicious, clinging to the story of damage and loss. Rumors had a way of growing stronger than facts, and now they were a force to reckon with. Thomas realized that facts alone might not be enough. He would need something more, something to bridge the gap between suspicion and trust. The chief listened silently, weighing every word. Thomas could feel the power of tradition and authority pressing down on him, the weight of generations judging not just his actions, but his character. He stood quietly, respecting the process, knowing that any display of anger or frustration could be seen as disrespect. Patience, he reminded himself again, was the key. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, the meeting paused. The chief spoke to the community, asking for calm and patience. Everyone would return the next day for a full council session, where all voices could be heard, and a decision would be made. Thomas was given permission to return to his ranch, though the feeling of unease followed him. That night, as Thomas sat by the fire, he reflected on the day. The valley was quiet again, but the tension lingered like a shadow. He thought of the young chief's daughter who had observed silently, her eyes sharp and attentive. Somehow, he felt that she might play a role in the resolution, though he did not yet understand how. He reminded himself that truth and patience often revealed themselves in unexpected ways. The rancher knew that the next day would be critical. The community would gather again, questions would be asked, and judgment would be made. He would have to rely not only on facts but on trust, honesty, and perhaps even a little courage from unexpected sources. He looked out at the valley one last time that night, letting the cool air calm his thoughts. Tomorrow, he would face the gathering again, ready to speak the truth and hope that it was enough. As the stars appeared in the sky, the valley seemed peaceful once more, but underneath the quiet, anticipation thrummed like the heartbeat of the land itself. Thomas went to bed that night knowing that his life, his reputation, and the trust between him and the Apache community hung in the balance. And somewhere in the distance, the chief's daughter watched, silent and thoughtful, as if she already understood something everyone else had yet to see. The story of that first day, of suspicion and quiet courage, was only the beginning. Tomorrow, the valley would see a test of honesty, patience, and the power of words that could either divide or unite. And Thomas, the quiet rancher who had always lived simply, was about to become part of a story larger than he had ever imagined. The next morning, the valley was alive with whispers. Word of the rancher's upcoming meeting with the full council had spread quickly. People from both the Apache community and the surrounding ranches began arriving near the gathering place. Thomas, the rancher, woke early, the memory of yesterday's tension still heavy in his mind. He moved through his morning chores with careful focus, trying to calm his nerves. Every task, from feeding the cattle to repairing a broken fence, felt slower than usual, weighed down by the anxiety of what was to come. By mid-morning, the sun shone brightly, turning the valley into a warm golden hue. The air was crisp, and a gentle breeze carried the faint scent of wildflowers and freshly turned soil. Despite the beauty of the day, a tension hung thick in the air. Groups of people began gathering near the open space where the meeting would take place. The elders sat together in a line, serious and composed, while others stood behind them, forming a circle that expanded like ripples in water. Thomas arrived just as the crowd was forming. He walked steadily, his hat pulled low against the sun, his hands steady despite the nervous energy in his chest. His dog, loyal as always, trotted beside him, sensing the unease in his master. On either side, neighbors and members of the Apache community exchanged cautious greetings. Some offered nods of encouragement. Others, expressions were more guarded. Everyone had an opinion, and most were anxious to see what would unfold. The chief, tall and dignified with a voice that carried authority, motioned for the meeting to begin. Silence fell immediately, a silence that felt heavy, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. Thomas stepped forward, his eyes scanning the circle of faces. He could see suspicion, curiosity, and some faint traces of hope, and he could see her, the chief's daughter. She stood slightly apart, calm, her gaze steady and attentive. Something in her presence gave Thomas a small measure of reassurance. The chief began. "We are gathered here today to understand what happened on the border of our land. A problem has arisen, and it is important that the truth is known. Accusations have been made, and it is only fair that all voices are heard." His words were calm but firm, carrying the weight of generations of wisdom and authority. The chief's eyes met Thomas's, assessing him quietly, almost as if giving him a chance to explain before anyone else spoke. Thomas stepped forward and began recounting the events of the previous day. He spoke clearly, describing how the cattle had wandered accidentally, how he had tried to prevent them from crossing the boundary, and how he had always respected the land and the traditions of the Apache people. His words were careful and honest, each one chosen to convey both the facts and his genuine respect for the community. The elders listened quietly. Some nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the logic in Thomas's words. Others, however, remained skeptical, whispering to one another or shaking their heads in doubt. Rumors, Thomas realized, had grown larger than the events themselves. Stories of damage and disruption had taken on a life of their own, creating a narrative that painted him as careless and disrespectful. A young elder, who had always been known for his fiery temperament, spoke next. Many of us believe that the rancher should have been more careful. Even if it was unintentional, damage was done. The land suffers when boundaries are crossed. His voice was strong, resonating through the crowd. Murmurs of agreement followed. Thomas nodded respectfully. He understood the concern. Mistakes had consequences, but the intention behind actions mattered greatly, and that was what he hoped to convey. The chief's daughter stepped forward, her calm presence commanding attention without force. "Before judgment is made, we must consider all evidence and all perspectives," she said. Her voice was clear, and though it was gentle, it carried a weight that caused the crowd to quiet down. We must not allow assumptions to guide us. The truth must be sought carefully, and accusations should not be taken lightly. Thomas felt a quiet relief at her words. He did not know her well, but he could sense her fairness and wisdom. She seemed to see beyond the surface, beyond the anger and fear, and into the heart of the situation. Her presence gave him hope that the meeting might not end in judgment, but in understanding. Other members of the community began to share their perspectives. Some described what they had seen. Others spoke of past incidents that might have influenced the current suspicion. One man described seeing cattle near the edge of the crops, though he admitted he could not be sure which cattle they were. Another spoke of prior misunderstandings between settlers and the tribe that had created lingering tension. Each voice added complexity to the story, and Thomas listened carefully, responding politely when appropriate, never raising his voice or showing frustration. The atmosphere grew tense as questions became sharper. Some people demanded compensation, while others called for stronger boundaries to prevent future incidents. Thomas answered each question calmly, explaining what had happened and how he had tried to prevent any harm. He spoke not with anger, but with patience and clarity. Every word he spoke was measured, carefully chosen to avoid escalating the situation. As the meeting continued, it became clear that many were struggling to separate fact from assumption. Fear and past grievances had influenced the narrative, making it difficult for some to believe Thomas's account. The weight of history pressed down on him, and yet he remained steadfast, trusting that truth, if spoken honestly, could eventually be recognized. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. The community continued to discuss and question, and Thomas continued to answer. Some voices softened as they began to see his sincerity. Others remained doubtful, holding tightly to the stories they had heard. The chief observed quietly, his gaze moving between the rancher, his daughter, and the community. He said little, but every word he would eventually speak would carry the authority of wisdom and experience. Finally, as the meeting reached a natural pause, the chief addressed the crowd. "We will continue this discussion tomorrow with the council and the entire community present. This is a serious matter, and it is important that all voices are heard and that no decision is made in haste. Thomas, you will return tomorrow, and we will have the opportunity to understand the truth fully." Thomas nodded. He felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The day had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally. He had faced suspicion, questioning, and doubt, yet he had also seen signs of fairness and thoughtfulness, particularly in the chief's daughter. He left the gathering with a cautious hope that tomorrow might bring clarity. As he walked back across his land, he reflected on the events of the morning. The valley seemed quieter now, but the tension lingered. He thought about the community, their traditions, and the deep respect that must be shown to the land. He knew that earning trust took time, patience, and honesty. And he understood that even the smallest misunderstanding could grow into something much larger if not addressed with care. That evening, as Thomas tended to his cattle and prepared for the next day, he felt a renewed determination. He would face the gathering again, ready to speak the truth and show the community that his intentions were honorable. The chief's daughter, he realized, might be an ally in this journey, a voice of reason and fairness in a time of uncertainty. Night fell over the valley and the stars appeared, twinkling like distant lanterns in the dark. The wind carried the sound of rustling leaves and the occasional call of a night bird. Thomas sat quietly by his fire, thinking about the challenges ahead. Tomorrow would be the true test. The truth, he knew, could only be revealed if everyone listened carefully and spoke honestly. As he drifted to sleep, he felt a sense of calm mixed with anticipation. He knew the coming day would not be easy, but he trusted in honesty, patience, and the power of fair judgment. Somewhere in the shadows, the chief's daughter watched, thoughtful and observant, her mind already considering the right path for truth and justice. The valley rested, but beneath the quiet surface, the tension remained, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Thomas, the quiet rancher, prepared for the day when the truth would finally be understood and when suspicion might give way to understanding. The next morning, the valley seemed quieter than usual, but a tension lingered like fog over the land. News of the council meeting had spread, and more people from both the Apache community and nearby ranches had gathered near the open space where the discussion was to take place. Thomas, the rancher, woke before dawn, his mind heavy with thoughts of what lay ahead. He moved through his morning chores in silence, feeding the cattle, checking fences, and walking the familiar paths of his land. Each step felt deliberate, careful, as if the earth itself were waiting for what was to come. By mid-morning, the sun rose high, painting the valley in shades of gold and green. The gathering had grown larger than the day before. Elders sat together at the front, their faces solemn and attentive, while a circle of people stood behind them, forming a wall of eyes filled with curiosity and tension. Thomas approached slowly, his dog trotting beside him, sensing the seriousness of the day. The crowd parted slightly as he walked forward, the whispers of speculation blending with the rustle of the wind. The chief stood at the center, his posture straight and commanding. His presence alone seemed to quiet the crowd, demanding attention and respect. Beside him, his daughter stood, calm and poised, her eyes observing every detail. There was something about her, an air of quiet understanding, that made Thomas feel a flicker of hope. Perhaps today, the truth would finally have a chance to be heard. The chief began the meeting. Today, we gather again to understand the events that have caused concern between our lands. Accusations have been made, and it is important that every voice be heard. This is a time for clarity, honesty, and fairness. His voice was steady, carrying over the crowd with authority. Every ear turned to listen, every pair of eyes fixed on Thomas as if awaiting his explanation. Thomas stepped forward and began to recount the events of the previous day. He spoke clearly, carefully describing how the cattle had wandered accidentally, how he had tried to prevent them from crossing the border, and how he had always respected the land and the traditions of the Apache people. His voice did not waver, and there was a sincerity in his tone that some in the crowd could not ignore. Yet suspicion remained. Some elders whispered among themselves, exchanging worried glances. A few of the younger men shook their heads, unwilling to accept that the damage might have been accidental. Stories of past misunderstandings hung in the air, adding weight to the accusations. Thomas realized that facts alone might not convince everyone. He would need more than words to restore trust. The chief's daughter stepped forward, moving with quiet confidence. Her presence drew the attention of the crowd immediately. People leaned forward, sensing that something important was about to happen. "Before any judgment is made," she said, her voice clear and calm, "we must look beyond appearances and assumptions. We must seek the truth, not the story we wish to believe." Her words had an immediate effect. The crowd quieted and the whispers faded. Thomas felt a small wave of relief. She spoke with a wisdom beyond her years, and her words carried weight that even the most doubtful could not ignore. He realized that she might be the key to bridging the gap between suspicion and understanding. The chief's daughter motioned for a few witnesses to speak. One by one, people shared what they had seen. A farmer from the nearby ranch described seeing the cattle near the boundary, but admitted he could not be sure which animals were involved. Another witness explained how a gust of wind had startled the herd, causing them to wander. Each story added detail and context, painting a fuller picture of the day's events. Thomas listened quietly, nodding where appropriate, never interrupting, never showing frustration. He understood that patience and humility were his allies. He had always believed that truth had a way of revealing itself, even if slowly, and now he could see it unfolding before him. Despite the careful explanations, some doubts remained. A few voices in the crowd called for action, suggesting penalties or compensation. Thomas answered each concern calmly, explaining how he had tried to prevent the cattle from crossing, and how he was willing to make amends if any real damage had occurred. His tone was respectful, and his sincerity could be felt by many, though not all, in the crowd. Then a moment came that changed everything. The chief's daughter, who had been observing quietly, stepped forward once more. She looked directly at the chief and then at the assembled community. "It was not him," she said, her voice soft but firm. The 4 words echoed across the circle, simple yet filled with undeniable meaning. The crowd reacted instantly. Some gasped, others exchanged stunned glances, and a few shook their heads in disbelief. These 4 words, spoken calmly and clearly, shifted the focus of the entire gathering. People who had been convinced of Thomas's guilt now paused, reconsidering everything they had believed. The chief's daughter continued, her tone steady. The true cause was the wind and the animals' fear. The rancher did everything he could to prevent it. He respects our land and our traditions. The blame placed upon him is misplaced. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he remained composed. He knew the work was not yet done. The community still needed to process the truth and accept it fully. The chief's daughter's words had opened the door, but understanding required time and reflection. The chief rose, his presence commanding attention. He spoke with a voice that carried both authority and thoughtfulness. "The words of my daughter remind us that we must seek the truth carefully. Assumptions can mislead us, and quick judgment can cause harm. Today, we have heard the facts and the perspectives of those involved. Let us reflect and consider our next steps wisely." The crowd listened, the tension in the air slowly easing. People began to murmur quietly among themselves, discussing what they had just heard. Some nodded in agreement with the chief's daughter, acknowledging that they had acted too quickly in their assumptions. Others remained cautious but attentive, willing to hear more before making conclusions. Thomas observed silently, his heart steady but grateful. He realized that the presence of someone willing to speak the truth, even in the face of doubt, could change the course of events. The chief's daughter had shown courage and wisdom, and her words had the power to heal the rift that suspicion had created. Over the next few hours, more witnesses spoke, providing additional context and clarification. A neighbor described how he had seen the cattle frightened by a sudden noise, confirming the explanation given by the chief's daughter. Another member of the community shared a story of past incidents, showing that accidents could happen despite good intentions. Each piece of information added weight to the rancher's innocence. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted. The crowd, once tense and divided, began to show signs of understanding. People who had doubted Thomas now saw that he had acted responsibly and respectfully. Even those who had initially demanded penalties began to reconsider, recognizing that the situation had been a misunderstanding rather than negligence. The chief's daughter remained near the front, observing quietly. Her calm presence continued to guide the meeting, ensuring that every voice was heard and that the discussion remained focused on truth and fairness. Her courage in speaking those 4 words had set the tone for the entire gathering, showing that honesty and clarity could overcome fear and suspicion. As the sun began to lower in the sky, the chief called for a pause. "We will continue tomorrow with further discussion," he said, "but today we have seen the power of careful observation and honest words. Let us remember this as we continue to seek understanding and fairness." Thomas left the gathering with a sense of cautious relief. The tension of accusation had lessened, though the resolution was not yet complete. He returned to his ranch, his dog faithfully at his side, and took a moment to reflect on the events of the day. The chief's daughter had changed everything with her courage and insight. Her words had brought the truth to light and opened the way for reconciliation. That evening, as Thomas prepared for the next day, he felt a renewed determination. He knew that the path to full understanding would require patience and continued honesty. But for the first time since the accusations began, he believed that trust could be restored and that the valley could return to its peaceful state. The stars appeared in the night sky, twinkling softly above the valley. The wind carried the faint scent of grass and earth, and the quiet rustle of leaves reminded Thomas of the delicate balance between humans and the land they shared. He thought about the chief's daughter, whose simple words had held so much power. Courage, he realized, did not always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it came in 4 small words, spoken at the right time with honesty and conviction. As the night deepened, the valley seemed to rest, though the events of the day lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed them. Thomas, the quiet rancher who had always lived simply and honestly, understood that his life had been touched by wisdom and courage beyond his own experience. And he knew that the next day would bring the opportunity to fully restore trust and understanding between him and the community that surrounded his land. The story of the rancher and the accused incident had reached a turning point. With the chief's daughter speaking the truth, the path forward was no longer clouded by suspicion. Yet the final resolution had not been reached. Patience, dialogue, and careful reflection would still be needed. But for the first time, hope had taken root, and the possibility of reconciliation felt real. The valley, bathed in moonlight, seemed peaceful again. Thomas sat quietly by the fire, letting the warmth soothe his thoughts. He knew that the next day would bring further conversation, but he also knew that truth, once revealed, could not be ignored. And in that moment, he felt a sense of quiet gratitude for honesty, for courage, and for the simple power of 4 words that had changed everything. The next morning, the valley seemed calm, almost as if the events of the previous days had never disturbed it. Yet beneath the quiet surface, there was a tension that remained, subtle but persistent. Thomas, the rancher, woke early, his mind already filled with thoughts of the meeting ahead. He knew that today might be the day that would finally resolve the doubts, restore trust, and bring clarity to the accusations that had shadowed his life. He moved through his morning chores with careful attention, feeding the cattle, mending fences, and checking the gates. Each task felt more significant than usual. Every action carried weight, as though even the smallest detail might influence the judgment that awaited him. The sun rose slowly, spilling golden light across the fields and making the grass glimmer. The beauty of the valley stood in stark contrast to the tension that lingered in Thomas's mind. By mid-morning, the community began gathering again near the open space where the council would meet. Elders took their seats at the front, forming a solemn line that radiated authority. Members of the Apache community stood in a circle behind them, faces a mixture of curiosity, caution, and hope. Some ranchers and neighbors also gathered, their presence a sign of support for Thomas, but even their calm faces could not completely mask the anxiety that ran through them. Thomas arrived quietly, his hat pulled low against the sun, his dog faithfully at his side. The crowd parted slightly as he walked, allowing him a clear path to the center. Every step he took felt deliberate, measured, as if the ground beneath him recognized the importance of what was about to unfold. He could see the chief's daughter standing nearby, calm and poised, her eyes observing carefully. There was a quiet reassurance in her presence that bolstered his courage. The chief rose, his voice commanding attention. "Today, we meet again to seek understanding. The events of the past days have caused confusion and concern. It is our duty to consider every piece of evidence and every perspective before we decide. Let us speak and listen carefully, so that the truth may guide our decisions." Thomas stepped forward and began recounting the events once more, speaking clearly and calmly. He described the cattle wandering near the border, the efforts he had made to prevent damage, and his respect for the Apache land and its traditions. His words were measured and honest, but he also spoke of his willingness to make amends if necessary. His tone carried humility, and he spoke with a sincerity that few could ignore. The chief's daughter observed quietly, then stepped forward. Her voice, calm but firm, addressed the crowd. "We have heard the rancher's account and considered the evidence," she said. "We have also reflected on what might have caused the incident. It is important that we do not allow fear or assumptions to cloud our judgment. The truth is often simpler than the stories we imagine." Her words had a subtle but profound effect. The murmurs among the crowd quieted, and many began to nod in agreement. People who had been doubtful started to reconsider their stance, realizing that the situation might have been misunderstood. Thomas felt a quiet hope growing inside him. The chief's daughter's honesty had shifted the focus from blame to understanding, creating space for dialogue and resolution. Several witnesses then spoke, providing further clarification. One neighbor described seeing the herd startled by a sudden noise, confirming that the animals had not wandered intentionally. Another elder recounted past incidents where misunderstandings had led to unnecessary blame, emphasizing the importance of careful observation before judgment. Each account added clarity, and slowly, the narrative of suspicion began to unravel. Even those who had been most doubtful began to soften. People realized that Thomas had acted responsibly, that the cattle's wandering was an accident, and that the damage, if any, was minor. The community started to see the situation through a lens of fairness and understanding rather than fear and anger. Thomas remained humble throughout, allowing the truth and the calm voices around him to speak louder than his own words. The chief rose again, his gaze moving across the circle. "We have heard many perspectives today. It is clear that this incident was not caused by negligence or disrespect, but by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Thomas has acted with honesty and integrity, and we must acknowledge this." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Some people smiled, relieved that the tension was lifting. Others shook hands quietly, signaling a return of trust and goodwill. The atmosphere, once heavy with suspicion, began to feel lighter, as if the valley itself was breathing a sigh of relief. The chief's daughter stepped forward one last time, her calm presence a stabilizing force. "Let this be a reminder to all of us," she said, "that assumptions can mislead us and that patience, observation, and honesty are the best guides. The rancher has shown respect for our land and traditions. Today, we recognize the truth and restore trust where it was shaken." Thomas felt a wave of gratitude and relief. The weight of suspicion that had pressed on him for days began to lift. He looked around at the crowd, seeing faces that had once doubted him now filled with understanding. People who had whispered accusations now offered nods of respect, and some even approached him quietly to apologize for their doubts. The chief spoke one final time, his voice calm and deliberate. "Let this resolution be remembered. Let it guide us in future interactions. Trust is built through honesty, patience, and respect, and today we have seen these qualities in action. Thomas, you are cleared of all accusations, and we acknowledge your integrity." The announcement brought a sense of closure to the valley. The tension that had hung in the air for days seemed to dissipate, replaced by a feeling of unity and understanding. Thomas felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the truth had been recognized, and that the bonds between the community and himself had been repaired. People began to disperse slowly, conversations turning to other matters but tinged with a newfound respect. Neighbors and members of the Apache community exchanged greetings, smiles, and gestures of goodwill. The valley, once heavy with tension, now seemed vibrant and full of life. Birds sang more clearly, the wind carried a lighter tone, and even the cattle moved more freely, sensing the change in the atmosphere. Thomas returned to his ranch, his dog following closely. He paused for a moment, taking in the land that had been both the setting of suspicion and the witness to resolution. He reflected on the events of the past days, the fear, the doubt, the patience, and finally, the honesty that had restored trust. He realized how fragile relationships could be and how easily misunderstandings could escalate if not addressed with care and respect. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas sat quietly outside his home. The fire he had built flickered gently, casting warm light across the familiar landscape. He thought of the chief, of the elders, and especially of the chief's daughter. Her courage, insight, and honesty had been instrumental in revealing the truth. Without her words, the accusations might have continued to fester, creating a lasting divide. Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude. The experience had taught him lessons about patience, understanding, and the importance of clear communication. He also understood that trust, once shaken, could be restored but required effort, humility, and the willingness to listen and speak truthfully. As darkness settled over the valley, Thomas reflected on the transformation of the community. The fear and suspicion that had dominated the past days had given way to understanding and reconciliation. The valley, which had felt tense and uncertain, now seemed peaceful and full of hope. The rancher realized that sometimes the smallest gestures, the simplest words, and the quiet acts of honesty could have the greatest impact. In the quiet of the night, Thomas thought about the future. He knew that challenges would arise again, as they always do, but he felt confident that the bonds of trust and understanding that had been restored would guide the community through any difficulty. The chief's daughter, with her wisdom and insight, had shown that truth and fairness could prevail, even in the face of fear and doubt. The stars appeared above the valley, twinkling softly like distant promises. The wind carried the scent of grass and earth, and the rustle of leaves reminded Thomas of the delicate balance between humans and the land. He felt a quiet gratitude for the resolution, for the lessons learned, and for the courage of those who had spoken honestly and wisely. The events of the past days had tested patience, understanding, and integrity. They had shown the power of honesty, the importance of careful observation, and the value of speaking truth even when it was difficult. Thomas, the quiet rancher who had lived simply and honestly, now knew that the community had learned these lessons as well. As he drifted to sleep that night, Thomas felt a sense of peace and hope. The valley, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now seemed alive with possibility. The bonds between the rancher and the Apache community had been strengthened, and a lesson in honesty, courage, and patience had been shared with everyone who had witnessed the events. The valley rested under the night sky, calm and serene, but carrying the memory of the events that had brought both tension and resolution. Thomas knew that life would continue, and that trust, once rebuilt, would guide the way forward. He also knew that the words of the chief's daughter, spoken with honesty and clarity, would remain a reminder of the power of truth and the importance of listening carefully before judging. And so the valley returned to its quiet rhythm, with lessons learned, trust restored, and hope renewed. Thomas, the humble rancher, could finally breathe easily, knowing that fairness, honesty, and understanding had triumphed over suspicion, and that the community was stronger for it. The morning sun rose over the valley, spilling golden light across the fields and grazing cattle. A gentle breeze stirred the grass, carrying the faint scent of earth and flowers. Thomas, the rancher, woke early, feeling a calm he had not known for days. The tension that had weighed on his heart was finally lifting. After the council's discussions, the words of the chief's daughter, and the acknowledgement of his honesty, the path ahead felt clearer. He moved through his morning chores with a steady rhythm, feeding the cattle and checking the fences. Each step seemed lighter than before, each action less burdened by worry. The valley, which had felt heavy and uncertain in the days of accusation, now seemed alive with hope. Birds sang more brightly, and even the wind felt gentler, as if it too recognized the shift in the valley's spirit. By mid-morning, the community began gathering near the meeting place once more. Today was not just about words or accusations. It was about reconciliation, understanding, and the building of trust. The elders took their seats, calm and composed, while the crowd formed a respectful circle behind them. There were neighbors and ranchers present, as well as many members of the Apache community. Their faces showed relief, curiosity, and a readiness to move forward together. Thomas approached steadily, his dog trotting beside him. The chief's daughter was already there, standing quietly and observing the gathering with a calm confidence. She had become a symbol of fairness, patience, and courage in the eyes of the community. Her presence reassured Thomas, reminding him that truth and honesty could inspire change, even in the face of fear and misunderstanding. The chief rose and addressed the crowd. "Today, we gather not to judge but to heal." The events of the past days have taught us lessons about patience, understanding, and the importance of seeking the truth. It is time to restore balance and trust, and to recognize the courage and honesty that guide us. Thomas stepped forward, feeling a mixture of humility and gratitude. He spoke calmly, acknowledging the efforts of the community and expressing his respect for the traditions of the Apache people. He explained again that any damage caused by the cattle was accidental, and that he had done everything in his power to prevent it. But more importantly, he spoke of the lessons he had learned, the importance of listening, the value of patience, and the power of understanding before judging. The chief's daughter moved closer to the center. "We have seen how quickly fear and assumption can cloud our judgment," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the gathering. "But we have also seen that honesty, careful observation, and courage can restore trust. Let this day be a reminder that our actions and our words must be guided by fairness, not fear." Her words resonated with the crowd. People began to nod, quietly acknowledging the truth in her message. Those who had once whispered accusations now offered small gestures of respect toward Thomas. Conversations began to shift from blame to understanding, from suspicion to reflection. The valley, once heavy with tension, now seemed filled with a renewed sense of community. Several elders rose to speak. They shared stories of past conflicts, of misunderstandings that had caused division but were resolved through dialogue and honesty. They emphasized that mistakes happen, but it is the willingness to admit them, explain them, and act with integrity that truly matters. Their words reinforced the lesson that the community had learned over the past days. Trust is fragile, but it can be rebuilt with care and honesty. Thomas listened quietly, humbled by their wisdom. He realized that this experience had been about more than clearing his name. It had been about building bridges between people, restoring trust, and strengthening the bonds of community. He felt a deep gratitude for the patience and courage of the chief, the elders, and especially the chief's daughter, whose insight had been instrumental in guiding everyone toward understanding. As the day continued, members of the community approached Thomas. Some offered apologies for doubting him, others thanked him for his patience and honesty. The atmosphere, once thick with tension, now felt light and warm. Laughter returned, Conversations flowed naturally, and the valley seemed to hum with the quiet joy of reconciliation. Thomas felt a profound sense of relief. The weight of accusation had been lifted, replaced by respect and understanding. He knew that the events of the past days would be remembered, not for the fear and suspicion they had caused, but for the lessons learned and the courage shown. The chief's daughter, in particular, had left an indelible mark on the community, demonstrating that even simple, honest words could change hearts and minds. By afternoon, the gathering began to disperse. People returned to their homes and fields, carrying with them a renewed sense of trust and unity. Thomas remained for a moment, looking around at the valley he had called home for so many years. The sunlight glinted off the fences, the grass swayed gently in the breeze, and the distant mountains stood tall and steady. Everything felt more vibrant, more alive, as if the valley itself had been healed by the resolution of the misunderstanding. As he walked back to his ranch, Thomas reflected on the journey of the past days. The experience had tested patience, honesty, and courage. It had shown the power of listening, of observing carefully, and of speaking truth even when it was difficult. And it had revealed the strength of a community willing to confront its fears and assumptions in order to embrace understanding. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Thomas sat outside his home. The fire crackled gently, casting warm light over the familiar landscape. He thought of the chief, the elders, and especially the chief's daughter. Their wisdom, insight, and courage had guided the community through uncertainty and restored harmony. He felt a deep gratitude for their leadership and for the opportunity to be part of a resolution that had strengthened the bonds of trust. The valley was quiet now, bathed in the soft light of dusk. The wind carried the faint scent of earth and grass, and the rustle of leaves seemed to echo the calm that had settled over the community. Thomas felt a sense of peace he had not known since the accusations began. The lessons of patience, honesty, and understanding would stay with him forever, shaping how he interacted with his neighbors, his community, and the land he loved. As night fell, stars appeared, twinkling like distant lanterns in the sky. Thomas looked up, thinking of the chief's daughter and the courage she had shown. He realized that true courage often comes in quiet, thoughtful actions, the willingness to speak honestly, to stand up for what is right, and to guide others toward fairness and understanding. Her words, spoken calmly and clearly, had changed everything. The rancher's life returned to its peaceful rhythm. The cattle grazed freely, the fields remained vibrant, and the community moved forward together, stronger for the lessons learned. Thomas continued his work with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that honesty, patience, and respect could overcome even the deepest doubts. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of the incident became a lesson for the community. People remembered the courage of the chief's daughter, the patience of Thomas, and the wisdom of the elders. It became a tale of understanding, of how fear and assumptions could be replaced by truth, dialogue, and trust. Children learned the value of listening carefully, observing patiently, and speaking honestly. Adults were reminded that mistakes are part of life, but integrity and humility can repair any rift. Thomas often walked through his land, reflecting on the events that had shaped the valley. He felt a profound connection to the community and a sense of gratitude for the lessons learned. The valley, once shadowed by suspicion, was now alive with harmony and hope. The experience had strengthened his bonds with the Apache community and with the land itself. At night, he would sometimes look at the stars and remember the words that had turned the tide. Simple, honest, and brave words that revealed the truth and restored trust. He understood now that the power of words, when spoken with honesty and clarity, could change hearts, mend relationships, and bring peace. The valley continued its quiet rhythm, the wind carrying the stories of patience, honesty, and understanding. Thomas, the humble rancher, knew that life would continue to bring challenges, But he also knew that the lessons of these days, trust, courage, and fairness, would guide him and the community through any future uncertainty. And so the valley rested under the stars, calm and serene, its people wiser and closer than before. The accusations, the tension, and the fear had all faded, leaving behind a story of reconciliation, understanding, and the simple but powerful truth. Thomas looked out over his land one last time that night, feeling a deep sense of peace, knowing that honesty and courage had restored not only his reputation, but the harmony of the entire valley. The chief's daughter stood quietly nearby, observing the valley and its people. She knew that her words had made a difference, that courage and honesty had the power to change even the most tense situations. And as the night deepened, the valley remained calm, filled with the quiet promise of hope, trust, and lasting peace. The story of the rancher and the accused incident ended not with anger or punishment, but with understanding and unity. It became a lesson remembered by all who had witnessed it, a story of how trust, patience, and honesty could overcome fear and suspicion, and how even the smallest words, spoken with courage, could change the course of many lives.